Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that might give you chills, but don't worry, the good kind, the kind that makes you grateful for your cozy bed and modern medicine. We're heading back to the late 1400s, to a time when a mysterious disease swept through England like nothing anyone had ever seen before. This mysterious illness would come and go over the next 66 years, striking fear into the hearts of everyone from peasants to kings. And the wildest part? It could kill you in 24 hours, sometimes less. Imagine falling ill and knowing that by this time tomorrow, you might not be here anymore. But let's back up a bit. Let's set the scene. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot. Take a nice, slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1485 England, and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So, congratulations. You just woke up in the late summer of 1485, right when England is about to experience something completely terrifying, something that would become known by many names. The English sweat, Tudor Anglicus, the sweating sickness, the new acquaintance, or my personal favourite, stoop knave and know thy master. Yeah, the Tudors had a way with words. England in 1485 was just emerging from a brutal civil war called the Wars of the Roses. Think Game of Thrones, but real. George R.R. Martin actually based the Starks and Lannisters on the Yorks and Lancasters who fought this war. The air is different here in Tudor England. As soon as you step outside, your nose fills with, well, everything. The streets aren't exactly what we'd call clean. There's animal dung, human waste, rotting food, all just sitting there waiting for the rain to wash it away. People don't bathe much, maybe once a month if they're fancy. Most folks just splash their face and hands with water each morning and call it good enough. Your clothes would feel heavy and scratchy against your skin. Wool and linen mostly. Nothing stretchy or soft like we're used to. No elastic waistbands here, just laces and pins to keep everything together. And those pins, they were so important that women kept a special fund called pin money just to buy them. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the air from cooking fires. Food is fresh but basic. Lots of bread, some meat if you're lucky, vegetables from gardens, and always ale to drink. Water wasn't trusted, probably smart considering where most of it came from. And it's not just the smells and the clothing that would feel strange to you. It's the sounds too. No cars, no planes, no buzzing electronics. Instead, there's the constant clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones, people shouting to sell their wares in the markets, church bells marking the hours of the day. Life moved slower, but was far more precarious. One bad harvest could mean starvation. One wrong word to the wrong person could mean death. And medicine? Well, medicine in Tudor times was a mix of superstition, ancient Greek ideas, religious beliefs, and a few practical remedies that actually worked. Doctors believed sickness came from an imbalance of 4 humours in your body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of any one humour, you got sick. The solution was often bloodletting. Yep, cutting you open to let the bad blood out. Not exactly what the doctor orders these days for a fever. So that's the world where our story begins. August of 1485. The Wars of the Roses has just ended with the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor has defeated King Richard III and is about to be crowned Henry VII, starting the Tudor dynasty. But something strange is happening among the soldiers. Thomas, Lord Stanley, one of Richard's supposed supporters, held his troops back from the battle, claiming they were suffering from something he called the sweat. At first, people thought it was just an excuse. Lord Stanley was actually Henry Tudor's stepfather, so his loyalties were, complicated. But soon enough, everyone would learn this was no excuse. It was the first recorded mention of what would become one of history's most baffling diseases. 6 weeks after the battle, Henry's victorious army returned to London, and that's when things got really bad. By September, people in London were falling ill with something no one had seen before. It started with a sense of dread, a feeling that something wasn't right. Then came chills, violent shivers that shook your entire body. Your shoulders would ache, your neck, your back, your head. Everything hurt. And then the sweating began. Not just a little dampness, we're talking drenched, soaked through your clothes, through your bed sheets, sweat pouring off you like you're standing in a rainstorm. Your heart would race, your body would feel like it was burning up from the inside, nausea would hit you in waves, delirium would set in, making you confused, making it hard to think straight. And all of this happens fast, really fast. One account describes people who were dancing at court at 9 o'clock and dead by 11. 2 hours. That's how quickly this thing could take you. By October, just 1 month after the first cases appeared, 15,000 Londoners had died. 15,000 out of a city of maybe 50,000 people. That's nearly a third of the population gone in 4 weeks. The newly crowned King Henry VII was terrified. He postponed his coronation and fled the city. But no one really knew where to go or what to do. This wasn't like other diseases they knew. It wasn't the Black Death with its telltale buboes. It wasn't smallpox with its distinctive rash. This was something new, something that seemed to come from nowhere and kill before you even had time to say your prayers. What made the sweating sickness even stranger was who it targeted. Most epidemics hit the young, the old, the poor, those with weaker immune systems or worse living conditions. But the sweat? It went after the wealthy, the powerful, the prime of society, and it completely spared children and the elderly. There's not a single record of a child dying from the sweating sickness. Not one. London lost 2 Lord Mayors, 3 sheriffs and 6 aldermen in that first outbreak. Men and women in the prime of their lives with the best food, the best housing, the best of everything Tudor England had to offer, and none of it mattered. By the time winter came, the outbreak had faded away as mysteriously as it had appeared. People breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever this sweat was, it had run its course. They were wrong. So very wrong. The sickness disappeared for a while, but it would be back. In 1508 it returned for a second wave. Less deadly this time, but still terrifying. Then again in 1517, this time just in London. But the 4th outbreak in 1528. That was the worst. It spread through all of England except the far north and Scotland. The death rate was staggering. King Henry VIII, son of Henry VII, who'd survived the first outbreak, was absolutely terrified of getting the disease. When he heard one of his chambermaids had fallen ill, he apparently ran off in great haste to a distance of 12 miles. Can you blame him? Records from the time called it the easiest in the world to die of. Henry broke up his court and kept moving, changing houses like he changed his socks, which, the chronicles tell us, was pretty often. The king was known for being fastidious about his personal cleanliness, even if the world around him was less so. What made this fourth outbreak even more significant was that it was the only time the sweating sickness left England. It travelled by ship to Germany, where it killed thousands, including 3,000 people in the city of Danzig alone. From there, it spread to Poland, Scandinavia, and parts of Russia. Western Europe got lucky. For whatever reason, the sickness never reached France or Italy. Was it the climate, the terrain, something about the people? No one knew. By 1529, the outbreak had ended, but the fear remained, because everyone knew by now the sweat always came back, and sure enough, in 1551, it returned for its fifth and final appearance. The pattern was always the same. It would appear in spring, peak in summer, and fade away in fall, like clockwork, like it was tied to the seasons somehow. No one in Tudor England had any idea what caused the sweating sickness. Doctors at the time thought it might be a form of influenza. Others blamed evil mists and exhalations drawn out of the ground or impure spirits in the body. A physician named John Caius wrote an entire book about it in 1552. He believed people could avoid getting sick through diet, exercise and moderation in all things. Not exactly wrong, but not exactly right either. Modern researchers have different theories. Some think it might have been hantavirus, a disease spread by rodents. Others have suggested anthrax poisoning, but we still don't know for sure. The sweating sickness vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, and it never came back. At least not in the same form. There was something similar called the Picardy sweat that appeared in France in 1718. More than 150 years later, it had similar symptoms and was attributed to fleas on field mice, but it also included a rash which wasn't part of the English sweating sickness. So it's not clear if they were the same disease or not. What we do know is that poor sanitation and contaminated water supplies probably played a role. Tudor England wasn't exactly a clean place to live. Houses were built with wattle and daub, wooden frames filled in with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Thatched roofs made from bundled reeds provided shelter, but also made excellent homes for rats, mice, and all sorts of insects. Streets were narrow, crowded, and often ankle-deep in mud and waste. Butchers slaughtered animals right in the street, letting the blood run into open gutters. Tanners used urine and feces in their leather-making process, filling the air with the stench. Water came from rivers that doubled as sewers or from wells that could easily be contaminated. Most people drank ale instead, safer because the brewing process killed most germs. The combination of crowded living conditions, poor hygiene, and lots of rodents created the perfect breeding ground for disease. But that still doesn't explain why the sweating sickness targeted the wealthy instead of the poor. One theory suggests that it might have had something to do with the housing boom that happened after the Wars of the Roses ended. With peace finally at hand, people felt safe to invest in property again. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII created a new wealthy class who built grand houses. Large houses needed large staffs, which needed large kitchens, which attracted rats and mice looking for food. And here's the interesting part. Maybe the wealthy were more likely to get sick because their servants were constantly cleaning, sweeping up rodent droppings, and inadvertently releasing virus particles into the air. The poor, paradoxically, might have been safer because they were less clean. It's just a theory, but it might explain one of the most puzzling aspects of this disease. Let me tell you about one particular outbreak that shows just how devastating the sweating sickness could be. King Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, studied at Cambridge University alongside his friends Charles and Henry Brandon, the sons of the Duke of Suffolk. These boys were among the elite of Tudor society. In 1551, during the final outbreak of the sweating sickness, both Brandon brothers contracted the disease. They died on the exact same day, July 14th, 1551. Charles was about 13 or 14 years old. Henry was 16. Just like that, two bright young lives snuffed out. Their title, Duke of Suffolk, died with them. This is what made the sweating sickness so terrifying. It wasn't just that it killed quickly, it's that it seemed to strike without rhyme or reason. You could be young, healthy, wealthy, powerful, and none of it mattered. The sweat didn't care. After 1551, the disease began to fade away. Later outbreaks were smaller, more localized, and then it was gone, just like that. Just as suddenly as it had appeared 66 years earlier. But one thing about the sweating sickness has puzzled researchers for centuries, the fact that it offered no immunity. Most epidemics, if you survive them once, you never get them again. Your body learns to fight off that specific disease. Not so with the sweat, you could get it multiple times. In fact, there are records of people who survived 3 or 4 bouts of it before finally succumbing. One of those people was Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. She caught the sweating sickness in 1528 and survived. She wrote a letter indicating that Lord High Chancellor Thomas Wolsey had the disease as well. Both recovered that time. Anne wouldn't be so lucky with her next brush with death, but that's a story for another night. As you lie there, feeling the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, think about how different it would have been to lie in a Tudor bed. The mattress would be stuffed with straw, maybe feathers if you were wealthy. The room would be dark except for maybe a single candle. The air would smell of wood smoke and whatever was cooking downstairs. And if you started to feel that sense of dread, that foreboding that marked the beginning of the sweating sickness, well, your chances weren't good. Tomorrow we'll continue our journey through this mysterious plague, looking at how it changed the course of English history and exploring more about what daily life was like in Tudor times. For now, though, just breathe. Feel the comfort of knowing that the sweating sickness is long gone. Let the rhythm of your breath slow down, getting deeper, more relaxed with each exhale. The gentle weight of history settling over you like a warm blanket, carrying you back to your own time. Safe, secure, and very, very lucky to be living in an age of modern medicine. The pale morning light filters through the small, uneven glass of your Tudor window, glass that's full of tiny bubbles and ripples distorting the world outside. You're alive. Another day dawns. In the streets below, life goes on. The baker's apprentice stumbles by, half asleep, on his way to light the ovens before dawn. The sound of a distant cock crowing filters through the town. A dog barks somewhere, then another answers. Living in Tudor England means experiencing a world of contrasts. If you're among the wealthy, your morning might start with a servant bringing a basin of water and a linen towel for washing your face and hands. If you're not so fortunate, you might splash some water from a bucket shared by the whole family. Not that the wealthy bathed all that often either. The common belief was that water, especially hot water, opened the pores and let in disease. Bathing too frequently was considered dangerous. Instead, people relied on changing their linen undergarments to stay clean. The linen would absorb the sweat and oils from your skin, and you'd just change it when it got too dirty. That's where the expression keeping clean linen comes from. Cleanliness had a different meaning back then. The well-to-do would rub their bodies with linen cloths, scrubbing away dirt without getting wet. They might use a mixture of white vinegar and rose water to freshen up. Smelling nice was considered more important than what we would call cleanliness. And yet, despite what we might think of as primitive hygiene, the Tudor elite were obsessed with certain kinds of cleanliness. They kept their fingernails immaculately trimmed and cleaned. They washed their hands before eating. They changed their linen shirts, or shifts, frequently. It's just that their understanding of disease was, well, different. But back to our story of the sweating sickness. After the first terrible outbreak in 1485, people lived in fear of its return, and return it did. The second outbreak in 1508 was less severe, but still claimed many lives. The third in 1517 was mainly limited to London, but it was the fourth outbreak in 1528 that truly changed the course of history. The sweating sickness didn't just kill thousands of ordinary people, it reached into the highest echelons of power and altered the fate of England itself. Consider this. Henry VIII's obsession with having a male heir is well known. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary, but no sons who survived infancy. By the late 1520s, Henry was desperately in love with Anne Boleyn, but she refused to become his mistress. She wanted to be queen. So Henry began the process of annulling his marriage to Catherine, a process that would eventually lead to England's break with the Catholic Church and the formation of the Church of England, all because Henry wanted a son. And here's where the sweating sickness enters the picture. In the summer of 1528, just as Henry's great matter, his annulment, was being considered, Anne Boleyn contracted the sweating sickness. She was staying at Hever Castle, her family home, when she fell ill. Henry, despite his obsession with Anne, immediately fled to a safe distance. He sent his best physician, William Butts, to care for her instead of visiting himself. The king wrote to Anne, "There came to me suddenly in the night the most afflicting news that could have arrived, to hear of the sickness of my mistress." Anne survived. But the outbreak caused delays in the proceedings for Henry's annulment as various officials fled London to escape the disease. Cardinal Wolsey, whom Anne blamed for delaying the annulment, also caught the sweat that summer. He too survived, though he would later fall from power and die in disgrace in 1530 while being taken to London to face charges of treason. The sweating sickness tore through the Tudor court, claiming many lives and sending others, including the king, fleeing in all directions. The court scattered across the countryside, with Henry changing his residence almost daily, trying to stay ahead of the disease. And here's a thought that might keep you awake at night. What if Anne Boleyn had died of the sweating sickness in 1528? Without Anne, Henry might never have broken with Rome. The English Reformation might never have happened. His daughter Elizabeth might never have been born. The entire course of English history, and therefore world history, might have been completely different. All because of a disease we still can't identify with certainty. The terror of the sweating sickness wasn't just in how quickly it killed, it was in how it killed. Imagine lying in your bed at night, the rushes on the floor crackling slightly as a mouse scurries across them. The room is dark except for a single candle's glow. Outside, the town is quiet. Most people are asleep by now. Suddenly, that feeling, the one survivors described, a sense of doom washing over you. Your heart begins to race. Something is wrong, terribly wrong. You begin to shiver, not the mild kind when you're a bit chilly, but violent full-body tremors that make your teeth chatter, your muscles ache as if you've been beaten, your head pounds. And then comes the heat, a burning, consuming heat that seems to start in your core and radiate outward. Your skin flushes red. Sweat begins to pour from every inch of your body. Not the kind of sweat you get from working hard in the field or from sitting too close to the fire. This is different. This is like your body is trying to push all the water out through your skin all at once. Your bedclothes become soaked. The straw mattress beneath you grows damp. Your heart hammers in your chest, racing so fast it feels like it might burst. You're thirsty, desperately, painfully thirsty, but drinking doesn't seem to help. Nausea hits in waves. Your mind becomes foggy. It's hard to think, hard to focus. Faces around you blur. Voices seem to come from far away. And all of this happens within hours, sometimes as few as 2 or 3. By the time the local physician arrives, if there even is one in your area, you might already be beyond help. What would the doctor do anyway? Tudor medicine was ill-equipped to handle such a swift and violent disease. If you were wealthy enough to have a physician attend you, they might try bloodletting. That's right, making you bleed more when you're already weak and dehydrated from sweating. They'd use a sharp blade to cut your vein or apply leeches to suck your blood. The theory was that disease was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of any one humour made you sick, so if you had a fever, which meant too much blood, the solution was to remove some blood. Makes perfect sense, right? Other treatments might include herbal remedies. John Caius recommended warm drinks and herbs to promote even more sweating. The idea was that the sweat was the body's way of expelling the disease, so encouraging it might help. He also insisted that patients not be allowed to sleep. Extreme fatigue was a symptom of the disease, but Caius believed that sleeping during the sweating phase could lead to coma or death. So there you'd be, exhausted, feverish, soaked in sweat, heart racing, and your doctor would be forcing you to stay awake while feeding you hot drinks to make you sweat more. Not exactly restful. If you were poor, you probably wouldn't see a doctor at all. You'd rely on folk remedies, prayers, or maybe the advice of the local wise woman. One common treatment for all sorts of illnesses was theriac, a complex mixture containing dozens of ingredients including opium, myrrh, and ground-up viper flesh. It was supposed to be an antidote to all poisons and diseases. Did it work? Probably not for most things. But the opium component might have eased the suffering at least. For the sweating sickness specifically, people tried all sorts of desperate measures. Some wore amulets to ward off the disease. Others sealed themselves in their homes, burning specific herbs they believed would purify the air. Others fled to the countryside, away from the crowded cities where disease spread more easily. This is what Henry VIII did, moving from house to house to escape the contagion. But here's the thing about the sweat. Unlike many other diseases of the time, it seemed to affect rural areas just as badly as cities. There was no escaping it. The terror of the sweating sickness transformed Tudor society in subtle ways. People became more aware of hygiene, not in the way we understand it, but in their own context. Houses were cleaned more frequently. The rushes on the floor, dried reeds or straw that served as a kind of primitive carpet, used to be changed only occasionally. Now, in wealthy homes at least, they might be replaced more often or strewn with herbs thought to purify the air. Lavender, rosemary, sage. Windows were opened to let in fresh air, despite the common belief that night air was dangerous. Some people carried posies of sweet-smelling flowers, both to mask the general stench of Tudor life and in the belief that pleasant scents could ward off disease. This belief in miasma, the idea that disease was spread by bad air or foul odours, would persist for centuries, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Removing sources of foul smells often meant removing sources of disease, even if they didn't understand why. Life in Tudor England went on, even under the shadow of the sweating sickness. People still got up at dawn, they still worked the fields or practiced their trades, they still gathered in the marketplace to buy and sell goods, to gossip, to socialise. Markets were the heartbeat of Tudor communities. By the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, over 750 towns in England held weekly markets. These weren't just places to shop, they were the social media of their day. This is where news spread, where people connected, where life happened. Imagine walking through a Tudor market. The ground beneath your feet is muddy from recent rain. Around you, vendors call out their wares. A fishmonger displays his morning catch on a bed of reeds. A baker sells loaves still warm from the oven. A woman offers bundles of herbs and homemade remedies. The air is thick with smells, some pleasant, like fresh bread and roasting meat, others less so. There's the ever-present undercurrent of human and animal waste, the tang of sweat, the earthy smell of vegetables pulled from the ground that morning. People from all walks of life brush past you. A wealthy merchant in a fur-trimmed gown, a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs, apprentices running errands, children darting between the stalls, and through it all runs an undercurrent of conversation. Who's sick? Who's died? Where the sweating sickness has been seen most recently, how to avoid it, how to cure it. When the sweating sickness was active, these gatherings became both more necessary and more feared. People needed supplies, needed news, but coming together meant risk. Tudor clothing was not just about fashion, it was about practicality, status, and even protection from disease. If you were a common labourer, you'd wear a simple linen shirt next to your skin. Over that would go a woolen tunic or doublet, maybe reaching to your mid-thigh, and woolen hose on your legs. A belt at your waist would hold small tools or a pouch for your few precious possessions. Your shoes would be simple leather and you'd probably have a woolen cap. Women would wear a linen shift, like a long undershirt, next to their skin. Over that would go a kirtle, a kind of dress with a fitted bodice and full skirt. On top of that might be a gown if they could afford it. Their heads would be covered with a linen cap, and married women would add a veil. The wealthy, of course, had much more elaborate clothing. Men wore doublets padded to create a broad-chested silhouette with decorative slashes to show the fine linen shirt beneath. Their hose became more like fitted trousers. They might have velvet cloaks, fur trims, jewelled buttons. Wealthy women wore multiple layers, a shift, then a kirtle, then an overgown that might have detachable sleeves. Their headdresses became increasingly elaborate throughout the Tudor period, but regardless of status, everyone believed that clothing could protect you from disease. The linen worn next to the skin was thought to absorb harmful humours from the body. That's why changing your linen was considered so important for health. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, people might add specific herbs to their clothing or wear certain colours believed to ward off illness. Red was thought to be especially protective. Food in Tudor England was both simpler and more complex than what we eat today. Simpler in terms of ingredients. Most people ate what was local and in season. More complex in how those ingredients were combined and presented, at least for the wealthy. The average person ate a lot of bread. A lot. It was the main source of calories, often consumed at every meal. Depending on your status, this might be fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, or coarse dark bread made from rye or barley. Meat was a luxury for most people, eaten perhaps once or twice a week. Fish was more common, especially on the numerous fast days when the church forbade meat. Vegetables came from gardens, and fruit was eaten in season. Spices were expensive and used sparingly by all but the wealthiest. Salt was the most common preservative, used to keep meat and fish from spoiling. Meals were generally taken twice a day, a larger meal around mid-morning, dinner, and a lighter one in the early evening, supper. People rose and slept with the sun, their days dictated by daylight rather than clocks. Ale or beer was drunk by everyone, including children. It was safer than water and provided calories. Wine was for the wealthy. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, people became even more concerned about what they ate and drank. Certain foods were believed to either protect from or encourage disease. Garlic was thought to be protective, as were bitter herbs. Foods considered hot and moist, according to the humoral theory, were avoided during outbreaks, as they were thought to promote sweating. Water sources became suspect. Wells might be abandoned if people who drank from them fell ill. Springs and streams outside of towns were sought out as potentially purer sources. Home remedies were shared and tried with increasing desperation. Vinegar was sprinkled around homes to purify the air. Dried rosemary was burned. Windows were sealed against night air or flung open to allow fresh breezes, depending on which theory of disease you subscribe to. Through it all, the daily rhythm of Tudor life continued. It had to. Crops needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Trade needed to happen. Life went on in the shadow of possible swift death. And for most people, life was already precarious enough without the sweating sickness. Infant and child mortality was high. Women died in childbirth at alarming rates. Accidents, violence, other diseases all claimed lives regularly. The sweating sickness was just one more threat in a world already full of them. But its speed and its mysterious nature made it particularly terrifying. If you survived the initial 24 hours of the disease, you'd likely recover fully, but there was no guarantee you wouldn't get it again during the next outbreak. Unlike many diseases, surviving the sweating sickness once didn't make you immune. This fact alone made it different from other epidemic diseases of the time. The Black Death, for instance, would leave survivors immune, but the sweat could return to claim you even if you'd beaten it before. For the Tudor mind, this suggested something supernatural about the disease. If it wasn't following the normal rules of illness, perhaps it wasn't a natural sickness at all. Maybe it was a divine punishment, or something darker. Let's consider the case of Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's powerful Lord Chancellor. In 1528, during the fourth outbreak, Wolsey contracted the sweating sickness. He survived, but the experience seems to have shaken him deeply. Wolsey had been tasked with securing Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon. His failure to do so, combined with Anne Boleyn's enmity toward him, led to his downfall. In 1529, he was stripped of his government office, though he remained Archbishop of York. By 1530, he was being brought to London to face charges of treason. He never arrived. He fell ill at Leicester Abbey and died there on November 29th. His famous last words reflect his regrets. "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." Was this final illness the sweating sickness returning to claim him? Probably not, as it wasn't the right season. More likely it was something else, perhaps typhoid fever. But in the Tudor imagination, diseases were often seen as divine judgment. Wolsey's fall from grace, followed by his death before he could face trial, seemed like perfect poetic justice. Religious responses to the sweating sickness varied. Catholics prayed to saints for protection, particularly St. Roch or St. Sebastian, both associated with plague. Processions and masses were held to ask for divine intervention. As Protestantism began to take hold in England, particularly after Henry VIII's break with Rome, the response shifted. Protestant preachers might present the disease as God's judgment on a sinful nation, calling for repentance rather than saintly intercession. Either way, the sweating sickness strengthened the role of faith in people's lives. When medicine offered little help and the disease struck so swiftly, prayer seemed the only recourse. Churches remained open during outbreaks, despite the risk of contagion. The comfort of ritual and community outweighed the danger for many, and if death might come at any moment, better to be right with God, just in case. For the common people, life during an outbreak became a balance between necessary activities and caution. Markets might have fewer vendors and customers. Taverns might be emptier than usual. People might limit their interactions, avoiding large gatherings when possible. But life had to go on. Fields needed tending. Food needed to be prepared. Work needed to be done. Most people couldn't afford to flee to country estates like the nobility. They had to stay and face whatever came, and curiously, the poor seemed to fare better against the sweating sickness than the rich. Was it exposure to similar diseases that gave them some protection? Was it their diet, simpler and less rich than that of the wealthy? Was it just that fewer cases among the poor were recorded? We don't know. What we do know is that the sweating sickness shaped Tudor society, contributing to the general atmosphere of uncertainty and the awareness of mortality that characterized the age. It also provided an early example of public health measures. Towns affected by the sweating sickness sometimes imposed restrictions on travellers from infected areas. Houses where someone had died might be marked. Belongings of the deceased might be burned. These measures weren't always effective, and they weren't implemented consistently, but they represent early attempts at controlling the spread of disease through community action rather than individual protection. The sweating sickness made people more aware of their connections to others. Your health depended not just on your own actions, but on the actions of your neighbours, your community, your nation. A disease that could kill within hours forced people to think about their place in a larger world. And for the Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VIII, the sweating sickness represented a threat to their power and plans that they couldn't control through force or diplomacy. It was a reminder that even kings were mortal. As you lie there, feeling the weight of your blankets, the softness of your pillow, try to imagine what it would be like to live with that kind of uncertainty. To know that a disease could appear without warning and claim your life before the next sunset. The comfort we take for granted, not just physical comfort, but the security of modern medicine, of understanding how diseases work and spread, would be unimaginable to someone from Tudor England. For them, the world was full of unseen dangers. The sweating sickness was just one of many threats that could strike without warning, and yet they lived their lives, loved their families, pursued their ambitions just as we do. There's something both humbling and reassuring about that. Humans have always faced uncertainty, have always lived in the shadow of mortality, and we've always found ways to keep going despite it. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into your mattress. Far more comfortable than any Tudor bed could ever be. Feel the quiet safety of your room, free from the diseases that haunted our ancestors. Let that sense of security wash over you, gentle like a summer rain. Let it carry you towards sleep. Darkness has fallen over Tudor London. The streets are mostly empty now, save for the occasional night watchman with his lantern held high, calling out the hour. 10 o'clock and all's well. Though really, is it? The only other people out at this hour might be those visiting taverns, or, you're very unlucky, footpads looking for someone to rob. Best to stay indoors after dark in Tudor England, especially during an outbreak of the sweating sickness. Inside their homes, people are settling down for the night. Unlike us, they don't stay up late reading by electric light or watching screens. When the sun goes down, there's not much to do except sleep or worry. And during an outbreak of the sweat, there's plenty to worry about. Imagine yourself in a modest Tudor home. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, casting a soft red glow across the room. Most families sleep in one room, often in one bed. Privacy is a luxury few can afford. The mattress beneath you crackles slightly as you shift position. It's stuffed with straw that's been packed down by months of use. The blanket over you is heavy wool, a bit scratchy against your skin. A cool draft seeps in through the cracks around the window shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, someone coughs. A baby whimpers. An old dog sighs and repositions itself by the dying fire. This is how most Tudor people end their day, surrounded by family, lulled to sleep by the familiar sounds and smells of home. It's comforting in its way, until someone wakes in the night, shivering with that telltale chill that means the sweat has found them. When that happens, the household erupts into terrified activity. Candles are lit, the fire is stoked, neighbours might be called, someone runs for the physician if there's one nearby and the family can afford it. The race against time begins. 24 hours. That's all you have to survive the sweating sickness, sometimes less. Let's talk about a specific case, one that changed the course of English history in ways that still echo today. Arthur Tudor was the eldest son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was the hope of the new Tudor dynasty, carefully educated to be a king who would secure his family's somewhat shaky claim to the throne. At age 15, Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. The marriage created an important alliance between England and Spain. After their wedding, Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle in Wales, where Arthur would serve as president of the Council of Wales and the Marches, basically getting on the job training as a ruler. In March of 1502, both Arthur and Catherine fell ill with a sweating-type sickness. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. He died on April 2nd, 1502, after about a month of illness. Was it the sweating sickness? It's hard to be certain. The timing of his death, a month after falling ill rather than hours or days, doesn't match the pattern of the sweating sickness. But records from the time are incomplete, and diagnoses were imprecise. Whatever the exact cause, Arthur's death changed everything. His younger brother Henry, 10 years old at the time, suddenly became heir to the throne, a boy who had been raised for the church, not for kingship. And Catherine of Aragon, she was now a 16-year-old widow in a foreign country. Eventually, Henry VII and Ferdinand of Spain agreed that Catherine should marry the new heir, Henry, but the death of Henry VII in 1509 delayed these plans. When Henry VIII took the throne, one of his first acts was to fulfill the long-planned marriage to Catherine. He was 18, she was 23. You know how this story ends, right? Catherine failed to give Henry the son he desperately wanted. Years later, he would break with the Catholic Church to annul their marriage and marry Anne Boleyn, all of which might never have happened if Arthur hadn't died. If he had lived and ruled as King Arthur the Fine of England, with Catherine as his queen, the entire religious and political landscape of Europe might have been different. No Church of England, no Elizabeth I, perhaps no English colonization of the Americas in the same way. History pivoted on the death of one teenage boy. It's tempting to say, what if? What if Arthur had lived? But that's not how history works. It unfolds one day at a time, with each event shaping what comes next. Just like our lives, the sweating sickness that may have killed Arthur didn't return in a major outbreak until 1508, 6 years after his death. This second outbreak was less severe and widespread than the first, but the 1517 outbreak struck London hard, and then came 1528, the worst of them all. Let me tell you about what happened at Oxford University during that 1528 outbreak. Oxford, along with Cambridge, was one of the two great centres of learning in Tudor England. Young men, and only men at that time, came from across the country to study there. When the sweating sickness arrived in Oxford that summer, it hit the university population especially hard. Thomas Forrest, a student at Christ Church College, left a vivid account. The sweat began with us the 5th of July and continued until the 12th of August. In Oxford died of the same sweat many scholars very well learned. The university essentially shut down. Students and faculty who could afford to leave the city did so. Those who remained lived in fear. William Carey, the husband of Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, was among the victims that year. He died on June 23rd, leaving Mary a widow with 2 young children. At Cambridge University, similar scenes played out. The university closed and students were sent home. One of those students was Hugh Latimer, who would later become Bishop of Worcester and eventually be burned at the stake during the reign of Mary Wall. But in 1528, he was just a scholar fleeing for his life. The 1528 outbreak was also significant because it was the only time the sweating sickness spread beyond England's borders. Ships carried it to the European mainland where it ravaged northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. In the German city of Hamburg, contemporary accounts claim that more than 1,000 people died in 4 days. The city of Lübeck reported that within a few weeks, more than 2,500 people had died. In Copenhagen, Denmark, the death toll reached 4,000 for a disease that had previously remained confined to England, with a few cases in Ireland. This sudden international spread was terrifying. It seemed like the beginning of a pandemic that might sweep all of Europe. But strangely, it stopped before reaching France or Italy. Southern Europe was spared, no one knows why. After 1528, the sweating sickness disappeared again. For 23 years, people lived without the fear of this particular disease, though plenty of others filled the gap. Then, in the hot summer of 1551, it returned for its 5th and final appearance. By this time, Henry VIII was dead. His son, Edward VI, sat on the throne, or rather, ruled through a council, as he was only 14 years old. Edward was a sickly boy, but intelligent and devout. He had been raised as a Protestant, unlike his father, who, despite breaking with Rome, remained Catholic in many of his beliefs. Under Edward, England became more firmly Protestant. Churches were stripped of their Catholic imagery. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, establishing English rather than Latin as the language of worship. All these religious changes created tension. Many people, especially in the countryside, resented the disappearance of familiar rituals and saints. Others embraced the new ways eagerly. When the sweating sickness returned in 1551, it entered this charged atmosphere. Some saw it as divine punishment for religious changes, others saw it as a test of faith. One of the most notable victims of this final outbreak was not a single person, but a pair of brothers. Remember the Brandon boys I mentioned earlier? Charles and Henry Brandon were the sons of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and his 4th wife, Catherine Willoughby. The elder Charles Brandon had been one of Henry VIII's closest friends. He had even married Henry's sister Mary, briefly Queen of France, in a secret ceremony that initially enraged the king. But Henry forgave his friend, and Charles remained a powerful figure at court until his death in 1545. His sons, the young Charles and Henry Brandon, were students at Cambridge University when the sweating sickness struck in 1551. King Edward VI, about their age, was their close friend and companion. On July 14th, both Brandon boys fell ill with the sweating sickness at the Bishop of Lincoln's residence in Huntingdonshire. Despite the best medical care available, they both died that same day, Charles at about age 14, Henry at age 16. With their deaths, the male line of the Dukes of Suffolk became extinct. The title would later be recreated for other families, but the original Brandon line was gone. Edward VI was devastated by the loss of his friends. He wrote in his journal, "Two noblemen's sons died of the sweating sickness, Charles and Henry Brandon, one 15 years of age and the other 13. His account was slightly off. Henry was 16, not 13. But the pain of loss is clear. These were boys Edward had studied with, played with, grown up with, and now they were gone, taken within hours by a disease no one understood. This brings us to an important question. What exactly was the sweating sickness? Modern researchers have proposed several theories. One of the most compelling is that it was a form of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. Hantaviruses are spread by rodents, specifically by breathing in dust contaminated with rodent droppings or urine. The symptoms match those of the sweating sickness: sudden onset, fever, headache, muscle aches, extreme fatigue, and profuse sweating. The fact that the disease struck in summer months when rodent populations would be at their peak supports this theory. So does the fact that it affected the wealthy more than the poor. Remember how I mentioned earlier that wealthy Tudor houses were being built and renovated at a rapid pace during this period? Well, when you disturb old buildings or build new ones, you're likely to disturb rodent nests. And the most zealous cleaning, which would have happened in wealthy households, could actually make things worse by stirring up dust containing dried rodent waste. Servants sweeping and cleaning might have been inadvertently releasing virus particles into the air. The wealthy, living in these freshly cleaned environments, would have been more exposed than the poor. Other theories include a particularly virulent form of influenza, typhus, or even anthrax, but none of these quite match all the symptoms and patterns of the sweating sickness. We'll probably never know for certain what caused it. The disease disappeared after 1551 and never returned in the same form, but its impact lingered in the collective memory. References to the English sweat appeared in medical texts and historical accounts for centuries afterward. It became a benchmark for swift and mysterious illness. So what was it like to live through these outbreaks? Let's imagine the experience of an ordinary Tudor person. You're a merchant's wife in London. Your husband trades in wool cloth, a valuable export that has made your family comfortably well off. Not nobility, but solidly middle class for the time. Your home is a timber-framed building near Cheapside, one of London's main commercial streets. It's 3 stories tall, with your husband's shop on the ground floor, living quarters on the middle floor, and sleeping chambers above. You have 3 servants, a cook, a maid, and an apprentice who helps in the shop. Word reaches you that the sweating sickness has returned to London. At first, it's just rumours. Someone heard that a merchant from Bristol fell ill after arriving in the city. A woman collapsed in St Paul's churchyard. Then it becomes more real. The butcher 2 streets over has died. So has the wife of a goldsmith your husband knows. A servant in the mayor's household. People begin to take precautions. Your husband burns sweet-smelling herbs in the shop, believing they purify the air. You make sure the servants change the rushes on the floor more frequently. You give your children garlic to eat and hang dried rosemary in the bedchambers. Some of your neighbours leave the city, retreating to country homes or staying with relatives in areas not yet affected. But your husband's business is here. You can't just leave. Then one morning, your maid doesn't come down to start the fire. You find her in her small chamber off the kitchen, shivering violently despite the summer heat. Her eyes are glassy. She tells you she feels a terrible sense of dread. You know what this is. You've heard the descriptions too many times. You send the apprentice for a physician, but in your heart you know it's already too late. By midday, the maid is drenched in sweat, her skin flushed red, her breathing rapid and shallow. The physician arrives, solemn-faced, a pomander of aromatic herbs held to his nose to protect himself from contagion. He bleeds her, but it seems to make no difference. By evening, she's gone. A life ended in less than a day. Now the fear truly takes hold. Has she infected others in the household? Will you be next? your children, your husband? You scrub the maid's chamber with vinegar. You burn her bedding and clothing. You pray fervently, lighting candles to saints known for protecting against plague and sickness. For the next few weeks, you live in a state of constant anxiety. Every headache, every chill could be the beginning of the sweat. You scrutinize your family members for any sign of illness, but somehow you are spared. The disease passes through London like a storm, leaving death in its wake, but your household remains intact. When it's finally over, when no new cases have been reported for several weeks, life begins to return to normal. Markets fill again. Churches hold services of thanksgiving. People emerge from their self-imposed isolation until the next time, because that's the thing about the sweating sickness during the Tudor period. It always came back, until suddenly, after 1551, it didn't. The final outbreak in 1551 was centred in the north of England, particularly in Chester. John Caius, the physician who wrote the definitive contemporary account of the disease, was there to witness it. Despite its reputation for high fatality, Caius noted that in Chester, the 1551 epidemic did not have a marked effect on the demographics of the population. Records of burials and wills suggest that while many people fell ill, the death rate wasn't as catastrophic as in previous outbreaks. After Chester, the disease appeared in a few other locations: Devon, Exeter, Colchester, but these outbreaks were increasingly isolated and limited, and then nothing. The English sweating sickness vanished from history. Why? No one knows for certain. Diseases sometimes burn themselves out by becoming less virulent over time, or the population develops immunity, or the conditions that allowed the disease to spread change. Whatever the reason, the disappearance of the sweating sickness was as mysterious as its arrival. Let's take a moment to feel what that relief must have been like. After almost 70 years of intermittent terror, the disease simply stopped. The sword that had hung over Tudor England was finally sheathed. People could gather without fear, travel without worry, plan for the future with more confidence. The shadow had lifted. For us, lying here in our comfortable modern beds, it's hard to fully comprehend what it was like to live with that level of uncertainty. Yes, we've had our own pandemics and health scares, but we understand the causes. We have treatments, vaccines, antibiotics. Tudor people had none of that. They had prayer, folk remedies, and hope. That's all. Feel the weight of your body against your mattress, the softness of your pillow, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, in and out, in and out. These simple comforts would have been so different in Tudor times. Your mattress would be lumpy with straw or wool. Your pillow, if you had one, might be stuffed with down feathers if you were wealthy, or more straw if you weren't. Your blanket would be heavy wool, possibly itchy against your skin. The air in your room would smell of wood smoke from the fire, of whatever herbs were strewn on the floor or hanging from the rafters, of the people sharing the space with you. Privacy was a rare luxury. Most people slept in communal rooms, sometimes multiple people to a bed. The sounds of the night would be different too. No distant traffic, no hum of electronics. Instead, you might hear the call of the night watchman marking the hours, the barking of dogs, the occasional shout or song from late revellers making their way home from a tavern. And there would be the ever-present awareness of mortality. Not just from the sweating sickness, but from all the myriad dangers of Tudor life. Childbirth, infection from minor wounds, accidents, violence, other diseases like smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis. Life was precious and precarious. Each day was a gift not to be taken for granted. Perhaps that's why Tudor people embraced life with such vigour. They feasted when food was plentiful. They celebrated holidays with enthusiasm. They danced, sang, played sports and games. They loved and fought and lived fully in the moment because the next moment wasn't guaranteed. The sweating sickness taught them that, if nothing else. As you drift towards sleep, think about the resilience of those Tudor people. They faced a terrifying, mysterious disease that could strike without warning and kill within hours. Yet they carried on. They rebuilt their lives after each outbreak. They adapted, created, loved and planned for the future despite it all. There's a lesson in that, I think, about human endurance, about hope, about finding joy even in uncertain times. Let that thought settle over you like a warm blanket. Let it ease you towards sleep, toward dreams that might take you back to Tudor England, but safely, as an observer rather than a participant, and be grateful for the soft bed beneath you, for the clean water you drink without a second thought, for the medicines waiting in your cabinet should you need them. These are luxuries a Tudor king would have envied. Dawn breaks over the Thames. The river's surface turns from black to silver as the first rays of sunlight touch it. Mist rises from the water, shrouding the many boats already plying their trade on London's watery highway. The city is waking up, shutters open, fires are lit. The smell of baking bread begins to drift through the narrow streets. Another day in Tudor England begins. For those living through the times of the sweating sickness, each morning brought a strange mix of dread and gratitude. Dread of what the day might bring. Gratitude for having survived another night. Let's look more closely at how the sweating sickness affected Tudor society beyond just the death toll, because diseases don't just kill, they change how people live, how they think, even how they build their homes. Architecture in Tudor England was evolving rapidly. The end of the Wars of the Roses had brought a new stability that encouraged building. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s released vast amounts of land and building materials onto the market. Suddenly, a new class of wealthy merchants and gentry could afford to build grand houses, and build they did. The distinctive Tudor style, half-timbered walls with the wooden beams exposed, large mullioned windows, decorative chimney stacks, began to appear across the English landscape. Inside these homes, changes were happening too. Medieval great halls began to give way to more specialised rooms, separate dining chambers, studies, bedchambers that weren't shared by the entire household. Some of these changes were driven by changing tastes and increased wealth, but some may have been influenced by experiences with diseases like the sweating sickness. When an illness can spread rapidly through a household, having more separate spaces suddenly seems like a good idea. Being able to isolate the sick becomes valuable. Windows that can be opened to let in fresh air become more important. We don't have direct evidence that the sweating sickness led to these architectural changes, but the timing is suggestive. As the disease made its repeated appearances throughout the Tudor period, homes were becoming more compartmentalised, more private. Personal hygiene practices may have been influenced as well. While Tudor people didn't bathe often by our standards, they did care about cleanliness. The wealthy changed their linen undergarments frequently. They washed their hands and faces daily. They cleaned under their fingernails and used tooth-cleaning preparations made from herbs and chalk. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, these practices may have intensified. Contemporary accounts suggest that people became more concerned with corrupted air and tried various methods to purify their surroundings. The wealthy might carry pomanders, balls of aromatic substances like ambergris, civet, musk and herbs to ward off disease. These were typically held in ornate metal containers that could be worn on a chain or belt. Windows might be opened to let in fresh air, or sealed tight, depending on which theory of disease transmission you believed in. Floors might be strewn with fresh herbs rather than the traditional rushes, which could harbour all sorts of unpleasant things. In a world without germ theory, people were trying anything that might work. Religion, as we've seen, was deeply intertwined with medicine in Tudor England, but as the sweating sickness continued to appear and disappear mysteriously, it may have contributed to subtle shifts in religious thinking. The Protestant Reformation was gaining momentum during this period, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. One aspect of this challenge was questioning whether saints could intercede to protect people from disease. When prayer to St. Roch or St. Sebastian didn't stop the sweating sickness, it might have made some people more receptive to Protestant ideas. On the other hand, the terror of sudden death might have made others cling more tightly to familiar religious practices. Religion in Tudor England was a complex and contested arena. Henry VIII's break with Rome wasn't primarily about theology. It was about his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But once that break happened, it opened the door for more radical religious changes. Under Edward VI, England moved more firmly in a Protestant direction. Catholic imagery was removed from churches, the Mass was replaced with English language services, saints' days were downplayed in favour of simple biblical teaching. Then came Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who tried to return England to Catholicism, sometimes by force. The religious whiplash continued under Elizabeth I, who established a kind of middle way, a Protestant church with some Catholic trappings. Through all these changes, ordinary people tried to make sense of their world. When disease struck seemingly at random, was it divine punishment, a test of faith, or something more mundane, tied to physical rather than spiritual causes? The sweating sickness, with its mysterious comings and goings, must have seemed like a divine visitation to many, but its peculiar pattern, targeting the wealthy rather than the poor, sparing children entirely, didn't fit neatly into any religious narrative. Perhaps this contributed in small ways to a more naturalistic understanding of disease, not immediately, not explicitly, but as part of a gradual shift in thinking. Speaking of gradual shifts, let's look at how medicine was evolving during this period. Tudor medicine was a mix of ancient Greek theories, medieval practices, folk remedies, and increasingly new observations based on experience. The sweating sickness challenged this medical system because it didn't behave like known diseases. John Caius, whom we've mentioned before, was one of the most important English physicians of the Tudor period. His book on the sweating sickness, published in 1552, was one of the first detailed medical studies of a specific disease in English. While Caius still believed in traditional humoral theory, the idea that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids, he was also a careful observer. He recorded symptoms in detail. He noted which treatments seemed to help and which didn't. He tried to identify patterns in who got sick and who didn't. This approach, emphasizing observation and experience over ancient authority, was a small step toward what we would now recognize as scientific medicine. Not a revolution, but a revolution. Caius advised moderate living as a preventative measure against the sweating sickness. He recommended avoiding extremes of heat and cold, eating a balanced diet, getting adequate but not excessive exercise, and keeping regular hours. Not bad advice, really. While it wouldn't prevent viral infection, living moderately might help the body withstand disease better. Other physicians of the time recommended more specific remedies. Thomas Forestier, who had witnessed the first outbreak in 1485, suggested a mixture of blessed thistle, rosemary and marigold boiled in water with bread as a treatment. Would it have helped? Probably not directly. But staying hydrated is always good when you're sweating profusely, so the advice to drink herbal infusions wasn't entirely wrong. The most dangerous treatments involved bloodletting and purging, deliberately making the patient bleed or vomit to expel bad humours. These would have weakened someone already fighting a serious infection. Despite these misguided approaches, Tudor physicians were trying, they were observing, experimenting, learning. It would take centuries more for medicine to develop a true understanding of infectious disease, but the process had begun. Let's shift our focus now to how the sweating sickness affected Tudor politics and power. We've already seen how it may have influenced the course of Henry VIII's Great Matter, his annulment from Catherine of Aragon, but its impacts went beyond that. The disease's tendency to target the wealthy and powerful meant that it repeatedly thinned the ranks of the Tudor elite. Nobles, court officials, wealthy merchants, all were vulnerable. This created opportunities for social mobility. When established families lost their heirs, new men could rise. When court officials died, their positions needed filling. The flux caused by the sweating sickness, along with Henry VIII's break with Rome and dissolution of the monasteries, helped create the conditions for a more fluid society. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister from 1532 to 1540, is perhaps the most famous example of this mobility. Born the son of a blacksmith, he rose to become the king's most trusted advisor and one of the most powerful men in England. Cromwell's rise wasn't directly caused by the sweating sickness, but he operated in a world where sudden death was common and opportunities appeared unexpectedly. His skill lay in recognizing and seizing those opportunities. The sweating sickness also affected how the court itself operated. During outbreaks, the normal gathering of hundreds of nobles, officials, and servants became dangerous. The court would disperse, with the monarch and key officials moving frequently to stay ahead of infection. This disrupted the normal functions of government. Letters from the period complain about delays in justice, in financial transactions, in diplomatic negotiations, all because key people were either ill, dead, or had fled to safer locations. In a system that depended so heavily on personal relationships and face-to-face interactions, this disruption was significant. Decisions were delayed, messages were lost, confusions multiplied. The sweating sickness thus contributed to the gradual development of more formalized, bureaucratic government structures that could function even when individuals were absent. Again, not a revolution, but part of a long evolution. Now, let's look at how the disease affected ordinary lives. We've talked about the wealthy and powerful, but what about everyone else? For the vast majority of Tudor people, daily life revolved around agricultural cycles. About 90% of the population lived in rural areas, farming the land. Their lives followed the seasons, planting in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in fall, surviving winter. When the sweating sickness struck a village or rural area, it disrupted these patterns. If key workers fell ill during harvest time, crops might rot in the fields. If a miller died, grain might go unground. If a baker fell ill, bread might go unbaked. Communities had to adapt quickly. Neighbours would step in to help affected families. Work would be redistributed. Alternative arrangements would be made. This kind of mutual support was essential in a world without social safety nets. Your community was your insurance policy. You helped others because someday you might need help yourself. Markets and fairs were another important part of rural life. Weekly markets in local towns allowed farmers to sell their produce and buy necessities. Annual fairs brought traders from further afield, offering exotic goods and entertainment. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, these gatherings became both more necessary and more dangerous. People still needed to buy and sell goods, but coming together in crowds increased the risk of contagion. Some markets might be temporarily suspended. Others might move outdoors, spreading vendors farther apart. Attendance might drop as people chose to stay home when possible. For urban dwellers, the impact was somewhat different. Cities were already dangerous places in terms of disease. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and contaminated water made urban areas breeding grounds for various illnesses. The sweating sickness was unusual in that it didn't seem to spread more easily in cities than in rural areas, but the concentration of people made outbreaks more visible and more disruptive. Guilds, organisations of craftsmen and merchants, played a major role in Tudor urban life. They regulated trade, maintained standards, trained apprentices, and provided support for members and their families. During outbreaks, guilds might adapt their practices. Apprentices might be sent away from infected areas. Workshops might operate with reduced staff. Funds might be collected to support the families of those who died. The sweating sickness thus tested and sometimes strengthened these social structures. Communities that pulled together to face the disease often emerged with stronger bonds, despite their losses. Let's think about the specific experience of women during these outbreaks. In Tudor society, women were generally responsible for the health of their households. They prepared remedies, nursed the sick, and made decisions about hygiene and diet that could affect the family's well-being. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, this responsibility would have felt particularly heavy. The disease struck so quickly that there was little time for outside help. The initial care, perhaps the only care a victim would receive, would come from the women of the household. Women shared remedies and advice, creating informal networks of medical knowledge. Many of these remedies were based on herbs grown in kitchen gardens, plants like rosemary, sage, lavender, and thyme that had genuine antiseptic or calming properties. While these treatments couldn't cure the sweating sickness, the act of doing something, of taking action rather than passively waiting, probably provided psychological comfort to both caregivers and patients. For pregnant women, the sweating sickness posed a particular threat. Pregnancy already carried high risks in the Tudor period, with maternal and infant mortality rates that would horrify us today. Adding a disease that could kill within hours made the prospect even more terrifying. Records don't indicate whether pregnant women were more vulnerable to the sweating sickness or suffered worse outcomes, but the stress alone must have been tremendous. Let's take a moment to imagine a specific scene, a Tudor bedroom where someone has just fallen ill with the sweating sickness. The room is dimly lit by a single candle. The walls are plastered and painted with simple designs, perhaps flowers or geometric patterns. A wooden bed frame dominates the space, with a straw mattress covered by linen sheets and woolen blankets. The patient lies on the bed, already beginning to sweat profusely. Their skin is flushed red. Their breathing comes in rapid, shallow gasps. Their eyes are bright with fever. Around the bed, family members move with urgent purpose. A woman wrings out a cloth in a basin of cool water and places it on the patient's forehead. Someone else mixes an herbal infusion in a pottery cup. A third person kneels in the corner, praying fervently. The air is thick with fear, with love, with desperate hope. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows, by this time tomorrow, their loved one will either be recovering or dead. There is no in-between with the sweating sickness. Outside the window, life goes on. A cart rumbles by on the street below. Children laugh as they play some game. A church bell tolls the hour. The contrast between the crisis unfolding in the bedroom and the ordinary world just beyond the walls makes the situation even more surreal. This scene would have played out thousands of times during the various outbreaks of the sweating sickness, sometimes with a happy ending as the patient survived the crucial 24 hours. More often not. Let's return to the broader historical picture. The sweating sickness made its final appearance in 1551 during Edward VI's reign. By 1553, Edward was dead, not from the sweat, but from what was probably tuberculosis. His death sparked a succession crisis. Edward had named Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir, bypassing his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. Jane ruled for just 9 days before Mary I claimed her rightful place on the throne. Mary, a devout Catholic, set about reversing the Protestant reforms of her brother's reign. Those who resisted, including former Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, were burned at the stake as heretics. Mary's reign was brief, just 5 years, and troubled by failed harvests, economic problems, and an unpopular marriage to Philip II of Spain. When she died childless in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne. Elizabeth I would reign for 45 years, establishing a stability that England hadn't known since before the Wars of the Roses. Under her rule, England became a major European power, defeated the Spanish Armada, and began its first colonial ventures. The Elizabethan era also saw a flowering of culture, with writers like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser creating works that still resonate today. And through it all, through religious upheaval, political intrigue, international conflicts, and cultural renaissance, the sweating sickness remained absent. The disease that had terrorised England for over 6 decades never returned. Its disappearance remains one of history's medical mysteries. Did the virus, if it was a virus, mutate into a less lethal form? Did the human population develop immunity? Did changes in housing, clothing, or behaviour reduce exposure to whatever caused it? We don't know. We may never know. Like so many historical puzzles, this one may remain unsolved. But the impact of the sweating sickness on Tudor England is clear. It shaped royal succession, influenced architectural and hygiene practices, tested social bonds, and remained a source of terror for generations. As we lie here in our comfortable modern beds, it's worth remembering that the security we feel, our confidence that we won't suddenly be struck down by a mysterious disease that kills within hours, is a relatively recent luxury. For most of human history, people lived with levels of uncertainty we can barely imagine. Death could come swiftly, without warning, at any age. Medical knowledge was limited, treatments were often ineffective or actively harmful. And yet they lived, they loved, they created beauty, they built for the future, they found joy where they could. There's something profoundly moving about that resilience, about the human capacity to continue in the face of terrible uncertainty. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into your mattress. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your breath. Feel the quiet darkness around you, safe and secure. The sweating sickness is long gone. The people who lived through it, who feared it, who died from it, they're gone too, but their stories remain. Their legacy continues in the world we've inherited. In the buildings that still stand from Tudor times, in the literature and art they created, in the religious settlements they established, in the political systems they developed, and perhaps most importantly, in the lesson they teach us about human endurance, about finding ways to live fully even in the shadow of uncertainty. As you drift towards sleep, carry that thought with you, the knowledge that we are part of a long human story of survival, of adaptation, of finding beauty and meaning even in difficult circumstances. Let that connection to the past comfort you. Let it remind you of your place in the grand tapestry of human experience. And sleep well, knowing that you are the fortunate inheritor of centuries of human struggle, human wisdom, and human hope. Night has fallen once more over our imaginary Tudor town. Stars prickle the sky, visible in the darkness in ways we rarely see them today. No light pollution dims their brilliance. No electrical hum disturbs the quiet. The only sounds are the soft murmur of the river, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant barking of foxes in the woods beyond the town walls. The night watchman calls the hour, his voice echoing down empty streets. Inside their homes, Tudor people sleep, some in feather beds with embroidered canopies, if they're wealthy, others on simple pallets stuffed with straw, all in darkness broken only by the occasional gleam of moonlight through a window or the dying embers of a fire. They sleep and they dream, unaware that they're living through what future historians will call the Tudor period, a time of profound change, of religious reformation, of cultural flowering, and yes, of mysterious disease. We've explored how the sweating sickness affected Tudor England, from the royal court to ordinary households. We've seen how it may have altered the course of history by killing some and sparing others, by disrupting plans and changing successions. But there's more to this story, more to understand about how the sweating sickness fit into the broader context of Tudor health and medicine, about its legacy, and about what it can teach us today. Let's start by looking at the disease in context. The sweating sickness was just one of many health threats in Tudor England. Bubonic plague remained an ever-present danger, returning in waves throughout the period. Smallpox claimed countless lives, particularly among children. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was common. Malaria, known as ague or marsh fever, plagued low-lying areas. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 20 women died in childbirth or from postpartum infections. Of those who survived, many would go through the ordeal a dozen times or more during their reproductive years. Infant and child mortality was heartbreakingly high. Even among the wealthy, perhaps 1/3 of children died before age 5. For the poor, the numbers were worse. Life expectancy at birth was around 35 years. This doesn't mean most people died in their 30s. Many lived to their 60s or 70s, but high childhood mortality drastically lowered the average. Against this backdrop of constant health threats, the sweating sickness stood out not because it killed more people than other diseases, it didn't, but because of how it killed, its speed, its mystery, its apparent targeting of the wealthy and powerful. Most diseases of the time made some kind of sense to Tudor people. Plague came from miasmas, bad air, in crowded, filthy areas. That's why the rich could flee to their country estates and usually escape it. Marsh fever came from, well, marshes. Avoid those areas and you'd probably be fine. But the sweating sickness, it didn't follow the rules. It struck the clean, well-fed nobility as more readily than the unwashed poor. It came and went with the seasons, but didn't seem tied to any particular environment. It killed with terrifying speed, but then disappeared for years at a time. No wonder it captured the imagination, created such fear. No wonder we still talk about it 5 centuries later. The legacy of the sweating sickness extends beyond its direct impact on Tudor society. It influenced how we think about and respond to disease outbreaks even today. John Caius's book on the sweating sickness, published in 1552, represents an early example of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread through populations. While Caius still relied on ancient humoral theory to explain why people got sick, his careful recording of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes was remarkably modern. His approach, observing, documenting, analysing patterns, laid groundwork for how we study disease outbreaks today. He was asking the right questions, even if he lacked the tools to find the right answers. Another legacy lies in public health measures. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, Tudor authorities sometimes took steps to limit its spread. Houses where someone had died might be marked, travel from affected areas might be restricted, public gatherings might be discouraged. These measures weren't applied consistently or based on a scientific understanding of contagion, but they represent early attempts at what we would now call public health policy. The sweating sickness also left its mark on Tudor literature and art. References to sudden death, to the fragility of life, to the vanity of worldly pursuits. These themes run through the creative works of the period. Shakespeare, born after the sweating sickness had disappeared, nonetheless grew up in a world shaped by its memory. His plays are full of references to death coming swift as thought and to the unpredictability of fate. In Hamlet, the gravedigger scene powerfully evokes the levelling nature of death, how it comes to all regardless of status. This reflected the lived experience of Tudor people who had seen how even the wealthiest and most powerful could be struck down in hours by the sweating sickness. The disease may also have influenced the development of what we now call memento mori art, works that reminded viewers of their mortality. Skulls, hourglasses, wilting flowers, these symbols became common in Tudor portraits and decorative arts. Such reminders weren't meant to be morbid, rather they encouraged people to live virtuous lives in preparation for a death that might come at any time. When the sweating sickness could claim you before the next sunrise, such reminders must have seemed particularly apt. Let's shift our focus now to a topic we haven't explored much yet: Tudor entertainment and leisure. Even in the shadow of diseases like the sweating sickness, people found ways to enjoy life. For the common people, entertainment centred around holidays and festivals, many tied to the agricultural year or to religious observances. May Day, Midsummer, Harvest Home, Christmas. These were times of feasting, dancing, games and communal celebration. Music was everywhere in Tudor England. People sang as they worked, played instruments in taverns and homes, listened to minstrels at markets and fairs. Henry VIII himself was an accomplished musician, composer and dancer. Games and sports were popular across all social classes. Children played with hoops, balls and tops. Adults enjoyed board games like chess and backgammon. Outdoor sports included football, much rougher than today's version, wrestling, archery and various ball games. Blood sports were also common. Bear baiting, bull baiting and cockfighting attracted large crowds. To modern sensibilities, these seem cruel, but Tudor people saw them differently, as tests of courage and demonstrations of the natural order. Theatre emerged as a major form of entertainment during the Tudor period, especially under Elizabeth I, and the first permanent theatres in England were built in the 1570s. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, London had several theatres drawing crowds of thousands. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Jonson and other playwrights created works that appealed to all social classes. Groundlings paid a penny to stand in the yard, while wealthier patrons sat in covered galleries. Everyone, from apprentices to nobles, shared the experience. During outbreaks of disease, theatres might close temporarily, but the human need for entertainment, for distraction, for communal experience always brought them back. Wine and ale flowed freely in Tudor England. Taverns were social hubs where news was shared, deals were made and tensions were released. Drinking songs, crude jokes and tall tales made the rounds, providing relief from the hardships of daily life. For the wealthy, entertainment was more elaborate. Banquets featuring dozens of dishes, musicians and performers hired for private shows, hunting in royal forests, dancing in great halls, masks, elaborate theatrical productions combining dance, music, poetry and spectacle became popular at court. These often carried political messages, celebrating the monarch's power or commemorating important events. Life wasn't all work and disease in Tudor England. Even with the threat of the sweating sickness looming, people found time for joy, for laughter, for the pleasures that make life worth living. Perhaps this is one of the most important lessons we can take from the Tudor experience of the sweating sickness. Life goes on. Humans adapt. We find ways to celebrate even in difficult circumstances. Another aspect of Tudor life we haven't explored fully is education. How did people learn in a world where sudden death was an ever-present possibility? For most children, formal education was limited or non-existent. Boys in rural areas might attend a parish school for a few years to learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Girls typically learned domestic skills from their mothers. Most education was practical, preparing children for the work they would do as adults. Apprenticeships were the main form of professional education. Boys as young as 7 might be sent to live with a master craftsman, learning a trade over 7 to 10 years. These arrangements were formalised in contracts that specified what the master would provide and what the apprentice would learn. For the wealthy, education was more extensive. Boys attended grammar schools where they studied Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and mathematics. Girls from noble families might have tutors who taught them languages, music, needlework, and household management. Universities, Oxford and Cambridge, were reserved for men preparing for careers in the church, law, or government. The curriculum remained largely medieval, focusing on theology, philosophy, and classical languages. During outbreaks of the sweating sickness, education, like everything else, might be disrupted. Schools and universities sometimes closed. Tutors might flee affected areas. Apprenticeships might be interrupted by the death of either master or apprentice. But education, like life itself, adapted. Learning continued. Knowledge was preserved and expanded, even in the face of disease and uncertainty. This resilience is a recurring theme in the story of the sweating sickness. Tudor society bent but did not break under its pressures. People found ways to continue the essential activities of life, working, learning, loving, celebrating, while adapting to the realities of the disease. Let's look now at how the sweating sickness fits into the broader story of Tudor England's place in world history. The Tudor period saw England transform from a relatively minor European kingdom into an emerging global power. When Henry VII took the throne in 1485, England was still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. Its economy was primarily agricultural. Its political influence was limited largely to the British Isles. By the time Elizabeth I died in 1603, England had defeated the Spanish Armada, established trading relationships across Europe and into the Ottoman Empire, and taken its first steps toward colonial expansion with the founding of Roanoke Colony in what would become Virginia. This transformation took place despite, or perhaps partly because of, the disruptions caused by events like the sweating sickness. When established patterns are broken, new possibilities emerge. The dissolution of the monasteries, for example, released not just land, but also people. Monks and nuns previously dedicated to religious life had to find new paths. Some became teachers, some went into trade, some brought their learning and skills into secular society in ways that enriched the cultural and intellectual life of the nation. Similarly, the deaths caused by the sweating sickness created vacancies in government, in guilds, in businesses. These vacancies were opportunities for others to advance. The society remained hierarchical, but there was more movement within that hierarchy than there had been before. Trade expanded during this period, despite the disruptions of disease. The wool trade, long the backbone of the English economy, continued to flourish. New luxury goods began to arrive from farther afield: spices from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from the Americas. These new commodities changed daily life in subtle ways. Spices, once rare and precious, became more common in cooking. Sugar, previously a luxury for the very wealthy, began to appear in more recipes. Tobacco, unknown in Europe before contact with the Americas, became popular for smoking. All of these changes took place against the backdrop of recurring epidemic disease. The sweating sickness was just one of several health threats that Tudor people faced. Yet life continued. Progress continued. Human adaptability and resilience prevailed. Let's turn now to a question that has fascinated historians and medical researchers for centuries. Why did the sweating sickness disappear? After the 1551 outbreak, the disease vanished from the historical record. There were no more major epidemics, no more panicked flights from London, no more records of people dying within hours of falling ill with the characteristic symptoms. Several theories have been proposed to explain this disappearance. One possibility is that the causative agent, whether a virus, a bacterium, or something else, mutated into a less lethal form. This has happened with other diseases. Viruses, in particular, often evolve toward less virulence over time, as killing the host too quickly limits their ability to spread. Another theory is that the human population developed immunity. If enough people survived infection and retained some resistance to future infections, the disease might have had trouble finding new victims. Eventually, it might have died out or become so rare that it no longer caused noticeable outbreaks. A third possibility is that environmental factors changed. If the sweating sickness was indeed a hantavirus, changes in rodent populations or human-rodent interactions could have reduced transmission. Improvements in housing, food storage, or sanitation might have played a role. Or perhaps the disease didn't disappear at all. Maybe it transformed into something we now recognize as a different illness. The symptoms of the sweating sickness share some similarities with various modern diseases. Could it have evolved into something we now call by another name? We may never know for certain. The sweating sickness appeared before the development of modern medicine, before microscopes could identify pathogens, before the concept of viruses was understood. It disappeared before anyone could study it with the tools we now take for granted. All we have are descriptions written by people who witnessed its effects but had no way to understand its causes. In this, the sweating sickness serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of our knowledge. Even with all our scientific advancement, there are still mysteries in the world of disease. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us of this, how a new disease can emerge suddenly and change everything, how our understanding evolves as we gather more information, how much remains uncertain even as we fight to control the outbreak. Tudor people faced the sweating sickness without our advantages. No electron microscopes, no PCR tests, no antivirals or vaccines, not even a basic understanding of germ theory. And yet they coped. They developed theories, tested treatments, implemented public health measures that made sense within their understanding of the world. They adapted their social practices, their architecture, their daily routines to reduce risk as best they could. There's a lesson here for us. Human creativity and adaptability are powerful resources in the face of threat. When we don't know exactly what we're facing or exactly how to fight it, we still find ways to continue, to protect ourselves and each other, to build and plan for a future we hope to see. The story of the sweating sickness is, in many ways, a story about uncertainty, about living with questions that have no clear answers. about making the best decisions you can with limited information, about finding meaning and purpose even when the future is not guaranteed. These are timeless human challenges, as relevant today as they were in Tudor England. As our journey through the world of the sweating sickness comes to an end, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned, on the connections between then and now, on the threads that link us to those Tudor ancestors across the centuries. We've seen how a mysterious disease appeared suddenly, caused terror and disruption, altered the course of history in ways both large and small, and then disappeared just as suddenly. We've explored how people responded, with fear, yes, but also with courage, with innovation, with community support, with religious faith, with medical experimentation, with artistic expression, with continued engagement in the business of living. We've considered how the sweating sickness might have influenced architecture, hygiene practices, social mobility, government structures, medical approaches, and religious attitudes. And we've reflected on the resilience of Tudor society, its ability to absorb the shocks of repeated epidemics and continue functioning, adapting, evolving. What does all this tell us about ourselves, about human nature, about our capacity to face the unknown? Perhaps it suggests that uncertainty, while frightening, is also fertile ground for growth. That disruption, while painful, creates opportunities for positive change. That facing mortality, while sobering, can deepen our appreciation for life. The Tudor people who lived through the sweating sickness didn't know what caused it or how to cure it, but they didn't let that paralyze them. They acted based on the best information they had. They supported each other. They found meaning in their faith, their work, their relationships, their creative expressions. And when the disease finally disappeared, they moved forward. They built on what they had learned. They remembered, but they didn't remain trapped in fear. There's wisdom in that approach, I think, a wisdom we can apply to our own uncertainties, our own challenges, our own fears. As you drift towards sleep, I invite you to carry that wisdom with you, to remember that humans have faced the unknown before and found ways to thrive despite it. That adaptability and resilience are part of our heritage, gifts from ancestors who survived their own dark times. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into your bed. Feel the gentle rhythm of your breath. Feel the quiet darkness surrounding you, protective rather than threatening. The sweating sickness is long gone. The Tudor dynasty is long gone. But the human capacity for survival, for adaptation, for finding beauty and meaning even in difficult circumstances, that remains. It's in you as you lie there. It's in all of us. A legacy more lasting than any disease, any dynasty, any historical era. Rest in that knowledge. Let it comfort you as sleep approaches. Let it carry you into dreams that might visit Tudor England, but only as an observer, safe from the sweating sickness, free to explore that fascinating world from a distance. And when you wake, perhaps you'll carry with you a deeper appreciation for the simple miracle of modern medicine, of scientific understanding, of public health systems that protect us from threats our ancestors faced without protection. Perhaps you'll see your own uncertainties in a different light, knowing how others have navigated even greater unknowns. Perhaps you'll feel a connection to those Tudor ancestors, not just to the famous kings and queens whose names we remember, but to the ordinary people whose names are lost to history, who lived and loved and worked and played in the shadow of the sweating sickness. They are part of your story. Their resilience flows in your veins. Their legacy lives in the world they helped to build, a world that eventually became ours. Sleep now, wrapped in the comfort of that continuity. Sleep knowing that you're part of a human story that stretches back through centuries of challenge and triumph, of mystery and discovery, of fear and courage. Sleep and dream of Tudor England, its colourful clothes and savoury foods, its music and laughter, It's faith and determination. Dream of a world both utterly foreign and deeply familiar, where people not so different from you faced each day with whatever courage they could muster. Sleep, and when you wake, carry with you their gift, the knowledge that life goes on, that joy can be found even in uncertain times, that human connection sustains us through our darkest hours. The sweating sickness taught the Tudors about fragility, about how quickly everything can change, about the limits of power and wealth when faced with forces beyond human control. But it also taught them about strength, about resilience, about the human capacity to continue, to adapt, to find new ways forward when old paths are blocked. That's the true legacy of the sweating sickness, not just the lives it claimed or the history it altered, but the lessons it taught. Lessons about living fully even when the future is uncertain, about treasuring each day as the gift it is, about the profound value of human connection. Lessons we can still learn from 5 centuries later as we face our own uncertainties, our own challenges, our own fears. So rest easy, knowing you're part of that unbroken human chain, that the wisdom gained through difficulties like the sweating sickness has been passed down through generations, becoming part of our collective inheritance. Let that knowledge settle over you like a warm blanket. Let it ease you toward sleep, toward restoration, toward dreams that might take you to Tudor England but will bring you safely home again. Good night, sleep well, and remember, we are the lucky ones.